Hello, friends, and welcome once again to This Century in Science. This week, we're coming to you from the 1800s, 1861 to 89 to be precise. And today we're talking about preventing infections and medicine, especially in hospital settings. We begin in Vienna in 1850. Ignaz Semmelweis has written a book covering his years of research in postpartum mortality. It's estimated that more than 20% of mothers contract puerperal fever after childbirth, and it's often fatal. It often happens in waves, plaguing particular hospitals or cities for weeks at a time. Women were known to sometimes give birth in the street to avoid going to a hospital. Semmelweis found that mothers who gave birth using midwives rather than doctors has 3 times greater chances of surviving childbirth. His theory was that it all came down to cleanliness, and thought vapors of sickness were being carried to mothers in labor. Semmelweis determined that the primary difference between doctors and midwives was that midwives were only delivering babies, whereas doctors were tending to other tasks as well, like caring for the sick and performing research by digging through cadavers. His solution was simple. Doctors should wash their hands in between procedures and in between patients. Or cadavers. Specifically recommending to wash with chlorinated lime or calcium hypochlorate, somewhat similar to what folks in 2020 would call bleach for its disinfectant properties. The response from doctors was negative, to say the least. The belief at the time was that
a doctor is a gentleman, and a gentleman's hands are clean and needn't washing.
Ignaz quickly became hated internationally, and doctors started writing letters and papers about how ridiculous he and his claims were. This wore on Semmelweis, clearly, and he started to become completely infatuated. Only this, and devoted the rest of his life to, with only defending his honor and helping women in labor. He was forced into an asylum, where it is believed that the doctors in charge gave instructions to treat him harshly. He died 14 days after being committed, ironically from an infection sustained from beatings from the asylum guards. We venture next to 1862 in France, where Louis Pasteur is developing techniques to prevent microbial growth in milk, which can be used in other applications. The technique is known as pasteurization, exposure to high heat. Onward to Scotland, where a doctor named Joseph Lister developed a carbolic acid solution, which can be used to wash doctors' hands, or sanitize surgical instruments, or even be sprayed directly into an open wound in an effort to prevent infectious growth. He would eventually become famous for the mouthwash that bore his name. We return then to France, where an associate of Pasteur's, Charles Chamberland, builds upon the techniques of pressure cookers of the day to develop the first autoclave, which would use high pressure and high temperature in order to sterilize surgical instruments. We then travel across the Atlantic to these United States, where President Garfield... No, that's not right. Thank you. Where American President James A. Garfield is assassinated a mere 4 months into his presidency. The assassin, Charles Giteau, believed he was owed a position as a diplomat, although the two had never actually met. Giteau fired at point-blank range, and one of the bullets barely missed the spinal cord of the president and was lodged amongst his internal organs behind his pancreas. The president remained conscious back to the White House, where doctors originally didn't think he would survive the night, but in fact, he survived for several summer weeks. The summer months that year were treacherously hot, and Navy engineers would develop one of the earliest versions of an air conditioner in an effort to keep the president comfortable. Famed inventor Alexander Graham Bell developed a metal detector in hopes of assisting doctors in finding the location of the bullet, such that they might remove it. It was unsuccessful for multiple reasons, including that the bed frame itself was made as metal and confused the signals. As a result, the doctors probed the president's innards with their unsanitized fingers and instruments, as hand-washing was not yet a common practice, especially in America. If it could be believed that it takes longer for scientific evidence about how infection spreads to gain acceptance in the United States as compared to the rest of the developed world. President Garfield was transferred to a special bed on the beach in Long Branch, New Jersey, thinking that the fresh ocean air would help cure him of sepsis, an infection that ravaged his entire body with pus-filled boils. Garfield died on September 19th, 11 weeks after the shooting. Years later, it would come to be scientifically and medically accepted that had doctors used sterile antiseptic techniques, he likely would have survived. Naturally, Giteau became a very hated man nationally, and his trial was a regular circus. His family maintained that he had been crazy for years prior to the incident. Every opportunity that he was given to speak in the courtroom, he either bashed his own defense attorneys, or he defended himself in the form of self-written epic poem, or he sang to the jury songs such as John Brown's Body. Giteau maintained that Garfield's death was an act of God, and that he was merely an instrument. He famously said on the stand,
Your Honor, I was guilty of the shooting, but it was the doctors who killed him.
So the lesson here is, even a certifiably insane murderer who would assassinate a president in the 1880s understood how important it was to take preventive measures to avoid the spread of germs.
Next stop, Germany, 1885, where Gustav Neuber takes a lot of the ideas we've talked about other people establishing and establishes the first antiseptic surgery room, including such concepts as regularly washing the doctor's coats and the patient's bed linens. American acceptance of antiseptic surgery techniques would really begin to gain traction in 1889 when William Stewart Halsted of Johns Hopkins invents the surgical glove, which he mostly did not for the patients, but for the doctors, who complained about psoriasis on their hands from all the antiseptic solutions. One can imagine a day in the future when it won't be so difficult to convince people of the value of science. The future, maybe 130 years. 2020. Yes, by then people should more readily accept logic and reason.